by Nick, our Director of Online Content, who is going to be running the stream and monitoring the chat and is providing the excellent technical support and facilitation. And also by Deborah, our Program Director, who shortly will be introducing you to our speaker, Dr. Frank Kadwell. First, before we start, though, I'd like to thank our sponsors who make these monthly events possible. First, San Francisco Partners helps us by providing some of the technical tools that we need to bring you these streams. And we also get support from InfoSet to provide our other activities. I'd also like to do a bit of housekeeping. We are putting out a call for volunteers to join our board. Specifically, we are looking for folks interested in volunteering as our vice president and as our membership director. These are roles that that have a lot of interesting opportunities coming up, and you can see more about them at our website, and you can go directly to the link earmac.ca/volunteer. As always, you can check out our website, earmac.ca, for other information about future events and other resources. But now I'd like to hand it over to Deborah, who is going to give you an introduction to Frank Kadwell and the talk that we are receiving today. Go ahead, Deborah.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. As Eden mentioned, I'm the program chair this year. And if you do volunteer, you volunteer for a year, you sign up and you get really good experience being on a board and understanding what that's all about. Carrying on today, our speaker today is Dr. Frank Kadwell. And he's a data management specialist with over 20 years of experience in the IT industry. He's from the States. Frank has been in data management for approximately, 20 years. Frank is a co-founder of D3 Information Services, a small boutique consulting firm specifically in Minneapolis. Frank and D3 assist companies in many data management challenges, including strategy, architecture, and development. He's consulted in many verticals, including financial services, retail, manufacturing, healthcare. And he's been on the board of Minnesota DAMA chapter board for 3 years. Frank is involved with local data meetups and academic organizations. And I understand, Frank, that our session today is based at least part on your PhD work. And so this is fairly exciting. We haven't looked at data governance for smaller organizations, and that's what Dr. Kadwell will be talking about today. And so data governance being one of the most important components of quality data management. However, small organizations hardly ever implement a data governance program, and why. This presentation describes why small organizations almost never create the programs and why that's a mistake. And the presentation will describe ways that smaller organizations can implement the successful data governance program, what works and what's important and what doesn't work. So thank you, Frank, for joining us today. And what I'd like to do is hand this off to you. If you want to take the screen over and get underway.
Thanks, Deborah. I'm just pulling up the screen now. Okay, I should be sharing. Cool. Hopefully everybody can see this. Thanks for that nice introduction, Deborah. And yeah, I would just echo that I'm on the Minnesota board and have been for a while now, and it is a really good experience. And DAMA is a wonderful organization, so can't say enough about. It's really the only real data organization that's out there. So thank you so much for that introduction, Deborah, and I'll go ahead and jump into it. Let's see. So as Deborah talked about, I won't spend too much time on this. I'm a data specialist over 20 years, co-founder of D3. And again, we're based out of Minneapolis. So people tell us that Minnesota is the most Canadian of all the 50 states sometimes. So hopefully I can fit into the culture okay. but it's wonderful to be speaking to people north of the border. I'm also an adjunct professor at Southern New Hampshire University. I teach some basic programming classes. I actually teach Python, which is interesting for getting into analytics. However, it also underscores the need for quality data, which we will talk about. And yeah, my dissertation was data focused and knowledge focused. It talked about how data is used and how much knowledge can be gotten out of data and information. But it was focused more on larger organizations. And so I'm extending that to include smaller organizations, because that's a lot of what we work with at D3. Within D3, there's just a lot of politics that go on, as everybody knows, trying to be on vendor management and those sorts of things when you're a smaller company. Being on trying to work with larger companies can be very difficult just from a practical standpoint. But also, we do feel that SMBs, small, medium-sized businesses, tend to be very underutilized and underrepresented within the world of data governance and data management in general. So we'll talk about that. And again, I'm both a DAMA I and DAMA MN board member, which Deborah talked about. So the agenda today, we'll talk a lot about the state of data governance, and specifically the state of data governance within smaller companies. I'm going to actually be kind of critical of my own industry, of the consulting industry, because we make a lot of mistakes. And a lot of times we wind up being blinded by being driven by profit, quite frankly, and that really kind of muddles the arena a little bit. So this talk really is not going to be on specific technologies. It's going to be more data governance from a whole, and what we see that works and what we see, quite honestly, that doesn't work, both from getting a program going and then keeping that program going throughout all of the projects and other things that are going on. And I'll apologize if there's a little bit background noise. Hopefully there isn't. The electric company decided today to trim trees. I had no idea, so I apologize for that if people are hearing a little buzzing in the background. Hopefully not. And so, yeah, we'll get into why organizations, especially smaller organizations, are having a hard time with data governance. There's a real disconnect, and we'll talk about that in the data results, from people talking about how they want to do data governance and how they want to implement programs. And I'm sure everybody's heard the buzzword of, data is the new oil and how important data is to organizations, but yet these governance programs have such a hard time getting started and keeping going. And we'll talk about what some of our experience is as a consulting firm on why that is. And a lot of that lands in how we, I think, approach data governance. I'm going to take a little bit of a look at data governance assessments. I think there's been a lot of those that are done, especially in larger organizations. And that's where I'm really going to take a critical look at consulting, because it's usually a consulting firm that comes in and gives these assessments. And, there's a lot of non-customization to the assessments and generalizations and things like that. And we'll talk about that as well. And then we'll talk about implementing data governance and what we've seen that has worked and has actually delivered value to small and medium-sized businesses or organizations as well. So kind of discussing the state of data governance. So I went ahead and took some data off the most recent survey I could find, which was 2019 Dataversity, along with Irwin. Did a survey, first of all, just to talk about who responded to the survey, because it was largely self-reported, or was self-reported. Most of the people that responded to the survey were larger organizations. So again, you're already seeing that smaller organizations, again, are not being very well represented. So the smaller organizations were somewhere around 15% of the response rate. But again, it's really hard to find ones that are actually done with smaller organizations. The other thing is that this is very self-reported, so please take that into consideration when you're looking at these numbers. So people that responded were data professionals or information professionals or those types of groups. So first of all, I'm sure nobody is going to be surprised by any of these numbers, but just to sort of this is really just to set a baseline for the rest of the conversation. So number one is fully implemented data governance is actually only around 15% according to the self-reported survey. So again, people are going to try to look at themselves generally in the best light. So 15% is a really bad number, and that's even down from 2018. However, there is some good news in some of this. At least partially implemented items like metadata or data catalog, data quality, you have 50% plus that are trying to implement programs around those particular categories of data governance. And then lastly, you have about 30% that are at least trying to start a data governance program. And what is driving a lot of these, what's driving the numbers in data governance today is a little bit different. Well, it's different than it was 10 years ago, but the family is the same. So in other words, what drives a lot of data governance, generally speaking, is compliance concerns and regulatory concerns. And the regulatory and compliance concerns are a much wider breadth than they used to be. So a lot of data governance projects went on in finance areas and other areas in the early days because of SOX compliance. Well, today, it's really a lot of it is about, and I'm sure this isn't a surprise, GDPR, the Canadian privacy law, as well as the states putting together their patchwork of privacy laws in different states, because of course, we all about state rights. So California has a very pretty tight privacy laws, and then you have other states that really have nothing. But companies that have any kind of breadth, even smaller companies, will need to adhere to these different ideas in these different areas of compliance. So there is a lot of movement. Again, it's all regulatory and compliance, which again tends to drive why people are doing these things. So again, if you put the two together of at least partial data governance work or data governance programs, you have 80% of the respondents are at least trying to get something started. You have only 15% though reporting that they have an actual mature program. And then so that means that you have still a very high failure rate, and we're going to go over kind of what leads to that. The other thing too to think about is if you have so many people abandoning their data governance work, then the SMBs and the organizations are not seeing the value in their data governance programs. So as a business, and especially for-profit businesses, we're all out there to make money and to find value and to drive profit. And if profit is not being seen, then through different programs, then those programs are going to wind up getting eliminated. So the data governance is not being prioritized to match the priority that many companies are putting on data. So companies are saying that they really value data, but the practice isn't necessarily there. And we see this in real life. We have a salesperson that does a lot of work for us, and he's a great guy, and he doesn't come from the data background. He comes from a different IT background. And as he's gotten into it, he and I have had many conversations about, he's brought up questions about, well, I called this one company and, they say they're just fine as far as their data is concerned. And what I've had to explain to him is when you call somebody up or when you talk to people, they're always going to say, our data is in great shape. We don't have any problems. But yet every place that I go to, they seem to have some problems, and a lot of them. So there's a lot of trying to put forth a different outside perspective than what's really going on internally. And I mean, that's all common. But I think as time moves on, there needs to be some real as we all agree, I think on this meeting, that's why we're here, some real data governance work. And how do we get, I think one of the biggest things is, how do we get any business, but especially SMBs, to realize the value of data governance? And so let's get into maybe why we see in our consulting world these things happening. So some of the reasons why. First of all, people view data governance, especially in SMBs, as onerous processes. So when I've gone into, there's a linen company locally here that we worked with for a long time. And the first thing when I walked into the business was, you seem like a really practical person, and that's why we hired you, because everybody else we talked to wanted to, put together all this documentation and all of these different things, which is important, but they aren't seeing the value in that. And an SMB is always looking at, where am I going to get the value? And that brings to a lot of places, and a lot of IT departments are trying to create these large programs. So right away, they go out, they look up things about data governance, and it's sort of, you're either doing nothing or you're doing something that's going to take, literally 20 to 30 people to implement, and you're going to have all these, steering committee meetings and all these other things. Where is the value in that? And we'll dive into that in more detail a little bit later, but a lot of these large programs, people get scared of them very quickly. And so from that, when these programs start, they lack the value to the business. So first of all, they're IT driven. So the business isn't seeing the value right off the bat, and they're not understanding what's in it for me. And at the end of the day, IT, whether we like it or not, is a cost center. So it's really about the value that is being brought to the business. And if the value cannot be seen by the business, then your days are numbered before you even get started. And the last piece is that there's very limited automation within data governance. So many of these catalogs or other things are maintained through manual processes, literally sitting there and entering in metadata on a spreadsheet. Well, as we all know, as soon as that thing is done, it's already old, because there's new data coming in all the time and all those sorts of things. So there has to be more automation in the process. And when I talk about automation, it's even getting creative. And I know, and I'll talk about this a little bit too, I know that we've started trying to research some things around, how do you actually automate data quality, in the sense of, there's a lot that can be done through machine learning to understand the quality of an organization's data. There's so much that can be done with language processing and all of these different things, which are much more accessible to small and medium-sized businesses, because when we get into the infrastructure requirements, we'll kind of talk about that at a high level, and the fact that, with cloud entering into it, there's all of a sudden not the need for nearly the day-to-day maintenance that used to be there. So some other reasons, brittle processes. So ETL, and we'll kind of talk about this again, is being disrupted. Why? Because people are moving this data around, and every time, I experience this at a current client right now, every time there needs to be a change, it has to go back through 5 environments or whatever, or 4 or 5 different databases to get to the source, and there's all this long lineage. And is that really needed? And in a lot of cases, it's quite honestly not. In today's world of data lakes and fast running processes and those sorts of things, the data does not need to move necessarily through as many processes as it's going through. And that's actually leading to duplication of data and those sorts of things as well, which brings me to the next one, which is data movement. One question that we're asking as soon as we enter into a client is, do you actually need to move this data? You might not. Or is it just going to be moved once and not moved the other 4 or 5 times? In the old days, that was really required because of the fact that machines didn't run as quickly. There had to be a real division between the way queries worked with a transactional system versus a star schema. That's the whole reason star schemas came around. And they were wonderful things in the days that they were used. However, that whole world is changing because it's almost like we've gone full circle. So there were the days of the mainframe storing huge amounts of data, and then you kind of moved to sort of this balanced thing of a data warehouse where everything's cleansed. Well, now we're winding up going back to sort of more, when you look at a data lake and it's more in its most basic form out on Azure or Amazon or Google Cloud, they are just files at the end of the day. And people are building tools that will just directly access the files. And so therefore data governance really becomes the security, privacy, and all of those things around that data. And then there's a lot of data duplication that goes on when we have all these different areas that the data is going into. The current client I'm at, again, and older clients I've been at, there's just so much, there's such a apprehension about joining across tables. And I've always been a little surprised by that, because that's what the reporting tools are for, is to show the user a unified interface. And they're quite frankly very good at that, but everybody for whatever reason gets nervous about that. And so then you wind up with data duplication all over your database that really from a data purist standpoint, you really shouldn't be having. And sometimes they are not getting the performance increase that they would expect. And then there's just a general, I think, lack of trust often between the business and IT. And I know that this is a hard one to talk about. I've quite honestly gotten myself in trouble when I've had direct conversations with companies about lack of trust within their organization or lack of trust within leadership and those sorts of things. But it's both leaders trusting each other, and then it's also leaders being able to trust the people that are doing the work. And that's another thing that I quite frankly have had issues with, again, in my current client, because there isn't the trust factor that this person is doing it right and that I've hired the right person. So those are a lot of the reasons that we're seeing, both cultural and technology driven. And so let's talk about the data governance, assessments that go on. So a lot of times a company, they don't have a data governance program. They're thinking about starting one up, and they go out to a consulting firm like us, for example, to talk about data governance, or usually they actually go to a larger one than us, because, you know, we're not I'll just be really honest, we're not a big name, and I get that. So they go to an IBM Global Services or something like that, and they ask for, let's get a data governance assessment. Another popular one, of course, is Gartner or Forrester, or those types as well. Well, the first thing that happens, right, is that so often the actual assessments are very, very cookie cutter. So they walk in, even though they're saying that they're looking at your processes in a custom way. And I'm going to be critical of my own industry here, quite honestly, because I think it's fair. It's a fair assessment. So they have these cookie cutter assessments. They come in, they say, yep, we're going to look at your stuff. We're going to give you a customized view. Also, I think that companies need to think about who's doing the assessment. So a lot of times, like at the state of Minnesota, which we've talked to a lot, you know, they'll oftentimes have Oracle come in and do their assessment. Well, what do you think that they're going to recommend? They're not going to go recommend IBM products. They're not going to go recommend Microsoft products. They're going to recommend Oracle products at the end of the day. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, one product is better than another, but one thing that I think that we see is really important, especially in the small and medium-sized business world, is getting things that are really more best of breed. So not necessarily lining up, you know, soup to nuts with an Oracle or an IBM or anything else. You really look at what your needs are and what needs to be done. And that's also why the cookie cutter approach to the actual assessment doesn't work very well. Another story to give is we went into a client and were able to implement at least some data governance practices in more of a medium-sized business, and they were really angry at the previous consultant that was in there. And the reason they were was because they wrote this, you know, 80-page assessment of things that was just not possible for them to do. Things like, you know, stand up a steering committee of 10 people and have, you know, make sure that you have data stewards across all of these different things. And they were just not big enough to warrant that type of personnel commitment to data governance. And so a person has to look at that when they're doing these assessments. So a lot of these assessments, I'm just going to be really forthright and honest, they drive consulting profits. And so we're looking to do the assessment. Now we try to really vary our assessments, I'll be quite honest, and we customize our pricing and everything else around the needs of the client. And so, you know, not to put too much of a plug there, but we've really worked at that. And, you know, we've lost a lot, you know, we've won and lost business both on that. But assessments are good money makers because they often drive into the actual project, which, I mean, that makes sense. And there's nothing wrong with that. But, you know, they do, you know, it is a way to enter into a client, and that's just fine, but just keep that in mind as you're kind of working through it. A lot of the assessments, again, and I got into this a little bit with the cookie cutter comments, but a lot of the assessments are very large assessments, and I'll try to hurry up here a little bit because I just realized I got a little bit to go here. Sorry about that. And so as a result, it becomes shelfware and it just sits on the shelf. And that's what was happening in this other place that we were at before.
So, Frank,
Yeah.
I'm also, you know, in this business of assessments, and I find that clients who've had assessments that they consider to be failures are ones where they get this 80-page document, or even, you know, a smaller one, but there's no action plan.
Exactly. And actually, you're driving right into, and I'll just go right to it. We must examine the how in our assessments. And so what we find in a lot of assessments, so we've been brought in to assess the assessors at times. Okay, we'll be happy to do that. And what we see in a lot of these assessments, it's all about the what. This is what you need to do. But how, to your point, Deborah, how do I set that up? How do I get there? It's sort of like, you know, I'm overweight, right? I know I need to go on a diet, but how do I go about doing that? What techniques can I use to actually make this happen? And so I echo that concern on assessments. And that's one thing that we try to do, is to enter into how are you going to do this, and how, and I'll get into what specifically we do. But for example, you know, how do you implement this within your own project so that it keeps going, right? And that's probably the biggest thing. Does that answer your question?
That's great. But, you know, not only how to do it with statements, but, you know, also how to gain traction, you know, what to do first, what prioritization you should put on things.
Yes. Yes, that's very important. What prioritization? And again, I think that's a mix of listening to the business, but and then also entering in as consultants. We have experiential things that we can provide. That's why we're being brought in, and that all makes sense because, you know, we've seen a lot more of these than somebody that's been at the same company for 30 years. And so
exactly.
Saying things like, our experience is that, you know, you should start with something like this in order to have a successful data governance program. So it's kind of like what I plead to my students all the time when they sit there and code, is that they sit there and try to code the whole thing in sort of one sitting, and then they wonder why they have 15 syntax errors and they can't figure out where they are. And it's the same thing in data governance. You're not gonna just chomp the whole thing all at once. And yeah, and that's where I think consultants can really then bring their value. And so the other two things is, again, examine the value and is there an ROI? Make sure there's an ROI. And more importantly, make sure that everybody understands what the ROI is. Because I think that's a big piece of what's leading to the failure of these various assessments and data governance programs.
All right, Frank, if you could back up again, just
Sure.
one slide. So, talking about value, I mean, so many data governance programs start with data quality as their main problem. And of course, the whole reason you're brought in for the assessment is because someone has seen a problem, and they say, oh, we can throw data governance on it. That's kind of the seed or the core that starts everything off. Now you'll find a lot of other things that are a problem once you get in there. But I'm wondering, suddenly I'm wondering whether data quality is the wrong target, because it's really seen as being at the work face and being in IT. Whereas, when you actually have to show value, you don't really show it there. Where you can show it is at the executive level if you deliver dashboards and scorecards and so forth, where they can turn the corporate performance measurements into real action, which will improve the bottom line of the company.
Yes.
I mean, that seems to be a problem, what the target is in order to show value.
I agree. And when the target is that, what we've gotten some traction with, and I'm not going to sit here and say we've always gotten a lot, but what has helped a little bit with data quality, at least, is to say, what is the price of this if you don't do something? So in other words, you have, and that's why I think that so much is regulatory driven. Because you had this data quality problem that led to maybe a breach, right? Or something like that. And breaches are very common right now. And so what is that costing you compared to, and so there's, I think it's sort of like, I mean, and this is a little bit different area, but kind of the same theme, is that Delta Airlines, for example, had like literally one person that knew the right COBOL things that literally shut down their aircraft for a couple hours for whatever reason. They literally had to call a person on vacation in order to get that fixed. And so when people are talking about upgrades and upgrading their systems and stuff like that, what did that just cost Delta Airlines? Because they were on something that was so old, they're literally paying somebody $250 an hour in order to just keep it running. So I think those things also need to be looked at. I think the other thing with data quality is it's kind of an interesting slippery slope, because it depends on what you're looking at. If I'm looking at social media data that's literally got petabytes of data that I'm doing machine learning analytics on, as long as I'm 95% right with the data, I don't care, because I'm going to be able to get the trends I want out of that information. However, if I'm over here looking at this highly detailed report of internal data and all that stuff, then that needs to be scrutinized a lot more.
Yeah, and culturally and readiness for data governance. Yeah, I find that, even if you do bring in a recommendation of, say, streamline this or that, or, you've got two financial reporting systems, put them together. You'll save four FTEs. They may not be ready for that kind of thing as they're fighting alligators elsewhere.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And so to your point, and I mean, we stress this when we go in there, is that, and we put it on all of our SOWs, that we need business involvement. I mean, that's one of the reasons, quite frankly, that real agile programs wind up being successful, because it's having requirements of the business that says, you guys are a part, you folks, excuse me, are a part of this, and it's not successful without you. So I think too often as well, the data governance programs, I mean, we have a current client right now, and we're just sort of more on the working side of it, so they don't listen to us on this piece, but they literally made somebody from IT the product owner. Well, you're just set up for failure then. I mean, that's a disaster. I mean, you can't, there needs to be a lot of business involvement, and the business needs to be listened to. Not that we know better than you do. Yeah, totally agree. And those are the challenges. And, you know, we'll get into some things that culturally that we sort of talk about. And I know that it's 11:35, so I'll try to kind of move through this a little bit faster. Sorry about that. But so bringing in data governance from the outside, and that's fine. We kind of talked about that. Another big thing, though, is that there's a lot of disruptive change that is going on in the arena, both within data governance itself, but also within mostly what data governance is feeding. So you've got to push towards analytics, predictive modeling, all of these things. And again, it gets to what you mentioned, Deborah, which is culturally, is the organization ready for it? For example, places talk to us and they say, yeah, we could really use some help with analytics and data science. Well, okay. First of all, what's your definition of analytics? And most of the time, a lot of places' definition of analytics is operational reporting. But leaving that aside for a second, then you start to get into the actual analytics conversation. Well, what's your data like? And that's going to lead again into data governance. We'll talk a little bit about automation again. And the biggest thing to me, and that helps with, especially with small and medium-sized businesses, is making governance a part of the normal process. So when we do a project, we do these things, for whatever they are and whatever they're defined as. And another key to that is to start small. Don't think that you're going to walk into a project and tell them to do a data catalog, metadata, a data quality plan, and all that, you know, the first go around. Just, it's not going to happen. So start small, and how do you incorporate it within projects? So what are some of the specific challenges for SMBs? Steering committees, right? I mean, when you walk into an IT department that has 5 people, the last thing that they're going to talk about is a steering committee. Fewer people. And they are always looking to maximize efficiency. And that means a lot of different things, which we'll get into in a minute here, but they also can't afford the larger tools. So you're not going to get, you know, you're not going to walk in and sell in a, you know, $300 or $400 million revenue organization Calibra. You know, it's just not going to happen. So we have to get creative within those organizations. Other SMBs. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, Frank.
Yeah, please.
Someone's asking in the chat, do you find the SMB has access to data governance tools that are fit for their purpose? Pricing, complexity, these kind of dimensions.
That's a really good question. I actually find that they are hard to find. I'll be really honest. Some of the things that we've done is sort of look to some open source options to help out. But a Calibra is not, because we experience, we're a small boutique consulting firm. Okay. We're smaller than almost anybody. I'll just put it right out there. Right. And they're not selling to us. They're selling to the larger organizations and trying to make their tools, because that's where they're seeing their profits. One of the things that we've had to work again with our sales guy on is that we're different. And are you willing to work within our environment? Because when we go to places, we are not looking to, like a lot of salespeople, when they sell resources, right? And I'm sure people that have been in large companies know this. You know, you have a consultant that's literally there for 2 or 3 years. We're not looking for that. We're looking for, we're going to be here for 4 to 6 months. Then we're going to go help out somebody else. Then we might be part-time maybe, or something like that. But I think the teams, almost even in the large companies, have gotten too large. So hopefully that answers the person question. Yeah, it's hard to find. I'll be really honest. And that gets to the next thing, which is they're always searching for turnkey products. So if you can walk into an SMB, especially in the manufacturing space, and this is where cloud comes into play. If you can go in there and not add people, but just say, you're going to pay for this thing, they will eat that up. But if you all of a sudden say, I'm going to take 5 of somebody's time to be over on a steering committee, you're in trouble. You know, I mean, there's got to be a balance there. I'm not saying that you just sort of throw that out, but there needs to be a balance there. And of course, they have smaller budgets. Was there any follow-up to that, Nick, or just want to make sure?
Nope, I think you did a pretty good job answering it. Thumbs
Okay,
up.
great. Thanks. So what are some of the foundations, just to kind of roll through this? I'll try to roll through this pretty quickly. So something that I've been talking about a lot is we need to align data governance with the business. It's about the value to the business side, not the value to IT. When we go back and I know it's important, I'm not saying that it's not, but like, for example, on a project that I'm on right now, all we're ever doing is doing data type changes or metadata changes or all these things. And that is of no value to the business. To Deborah's point, if you can bring out scorecards, if you can show things that are happening and be able to give them the access that they need, then you're getting somewhere. So usually, you know, we need to be aligned not just with the data, but with the business priorities to help them see the value. So if you're out working on something that is not a business, that is not a priority to the business, then you're fighting a losing battle, just to Deborah's point. And so when we come in, that's the first thing that we try to do. In fact, our most successful data governance projects have often been ones that are started with the business. And what we do is help the business talk to IT about how to drive these things. Another big piece is accountability. So there's accountability both in leadership, but there's also accountability for the developers or the people that are actually doing the work. And that's why as leaders, we need to take into account what the doers are saying. If I tell somebody that it's going to take me 2 weeks to get something done, you can't just magically tell me that it's going to be done in a week. I mean, and that erodes that trust. Those sorts of things really erode trust. And the reason that needs to be there and that everybody needs to be accountable is an SMB is generally a flat structure. There is no CDO. There is, I mean, you know, the C-suite is a lot of times 3 or 4 people that are all a part of the same family. And so it's a very, very flat structure. And kind of what I said before, the leadership needs to trust the team. You need to be able to trust that, you know, that because you can't know everything about everything within an organization, even within an SMB.
All right, within a small organization, I mean, you might have the CEO and the CIO, and you know that's about, you know, and a COO, that might be it.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, is our role then to get the right conversations going between those 3 people, you know, around the data, as opposed to just flopping around? I mean, I see the value of data governance as bringing IT and the business to the table for the first time, talking about data.
And I totally agree with you, Deborah, but in practice, or what we've seen too much of,
issues.
right? I'm sorry. Did I interrupt you? I'm sorry, Deborah. Go ahead. Are you there, Deborah? Maybe we're having, I apologize if I interrupted you, Deborah. I think you're absolutely right. The idea is to start the conversation. However, too often when we walk into an organization, IT is constantly telling the business what they should think. And that is a mistake that it's just too often made. And as a result, these data governance programs fail. So to your point, if you come in getting people to really honestly have dialogue, then that's a wonderful thing. We had a presentation actually in DAMA, Minnesota, and a person really put it well in the sense that this person, he really works in his consulting area to learn the language of the business so that the needs of the business can really be understood. So hopefully that answers your question, Deborah. Feel free to jump back on if, and I apologize. Hopefully, Nick, my connection's okay. I don't know. Something happened.
Yeah, that's
Yep.
great. Thank you.
Okay.
Everything's good on my end.
Good old technology. So this gets into, the other foundational piece is trust-based governance. The biggest piece of that is to realize that, and this gets into, again, Deborah, you're talking of conversation and how vital it is, and it really is, that all information is not equal. So if we're sitting in IT, we often look at information as information and the priorities are the same. Well, they're not. And it might be more important to discover and understand the customer data, in fact, it normally is, than it is to understand the product data, for example, or something like that, because it's the customers that come and have the experience. And so that needs to be correct and standardized, and just must be able to discover the data. The next piece is, or another big foundation, is around data ethics. And this gets into data privacy and data security. And just to give a difference between those things, data privacy is really about, keeping your customers' data private and what your standards are around that, making sure that you're adhering to all the data privacy different things. Data security is actually securing the data. So who do I allow to get into what and stuff like that. So they are different things. And the first thing that's important is to understand that they are different. Another big piece I think that really needs to be talked about is risk management. So it's important within data governance to be risk aware, but not necessarily risk averse. So there's a lot of, we can never release this thing until every single thing is absolutely correct, and you wind up with sort of analysis paralysis, as I like to call it. And there needs to be, there's always going to be outliers, especially with the amount of data that we're going through. And so a person needs to balance the opportunity with the risk that is out there. So again, if you're talking about something where you're doing social media, or you're trying to get some understanding of people's attitudes towards things and those sorts of things, you can probably deal with a lot more outliers. If I have a financial report, that thing had better be right, bottom line. So in that sense, you just need to manage your risk properly. Training is important, governance training, and everybody needs to be trained in governance. It's not just an IT thing, and it's not just a business thing. There's contributions that everybody makes. Learn to be open to new ways of doing things and make sure that your goals are measurable. Sorry, I'm just looking at my watch. Okay, got 12 minutes left. I'll try to kind of hurry through. So what works? What have we seen work? A big piece is cultural change and collaboration. So really collaborating with everybody. Everybody has a seat at the table. And in an SMB, that piece is actually easier because a lot of times there's fewer people. Sharing the knowledge, at least within the organization. So too often there's a lot of stories from the state, right? We've done work at the state of Minnesota, and a lot of times people think that you're in there to take their job. No, I'm not. I don't want your job. And so there's too much of that going on, and people have to be open to sharing. Another big, huge piece to stop is the blame game. So in other words, too often people don't say things because they're scared of getting blamed for what happened. And things go wrong, and that's okay. And it'll go a lot faster if we start rewarding transparency. If the person who raises their hand and says, yeah, I accidentally hit the off switch on the server, is not completely reamed for doing that, because guess what? Now that you know what happened, it's a lot easier to fix. That type of behavior needs to be rewarded. And that is a big cultural change. So one of the biggest things within an SMB is to take governance and to implement it as a part of the project. So very often they're doing agile, just like everybody else is. There needs to be spikes. People can't be afraid of spikes. That's where spikes are for, is this kind of work. And making sure to include governance components that, as Deborah describes, have been discussed within leadership. Okay, and you need leadership's backing, because there will be times that the leaders just say, look, we know you may not want to do this, but this is what we're doing. And making sure to attach governance to value. So being able to produce maybe a scorecard or something like that. And, you know, you can do that within smaller organizations too, that say, look, because we brought this down, guess what? All of this other stuff is working, and people don't have to go in and make all of these manual changes like they do all the time, and all those sorts of things. Another huge one is empowering the employees. So again, this empowerment is sort of has multifacets to it. Part of it is just empowering them to do things and to potentially make decisions. But another piece is to trust them in their decisions. So I'm literally working on a migration project that's been in the healthcare industry that's been going on for like 3.5 years. We're finally hopefully closing in on the end of it. It was like a 3-phase thing. And there's people within leadership that still continually ask us, who have been doing this for 3.5 years, understand the providers, all these things, sort of playing, for lack of a better term, armchair quarterback. And, you know, we know better because we come talk to you a half hour once a week, or probably more like once a month. And it's like, no, you just don't get it. And unfortunately, you're not, you know, you're not, you don't have a lot of respect for me when you're kind of, you know, quite frankly, acting that way. And that does not reap very many benefits. Sometimes thinking smaller is a better thing. So number one is we can look for a simpler solution. I've had times when the business has literally said, we don't need that, but yet the developers have insisted on fixing it. And it's like, whoa, that's a disconnect. And that's where people, again, are not being listened to. We need to make sure that we're listening to what people say. If the business gets no value out of XYZ, then take it out of the equation. Also, sometimes a simple solution makes sense. If there's not a lot of things to catalog, or if there's, you know, whatever, you know, is going on in the particular small to medium-sized business, maybe it's okay to just, you know, have some things that are maintained within simpler databases or those sorts of things, so that you're not trying to boil the ocean, so to speak. And structure some accountability. So there needs to be more than just the C-level folks that are accountable for it. Trust staff and don't always drive projects. So you need to ask the staff how long something is going to take, and they know the best. You know, the people that are down in the trenches. This is why Agile works, right? Because the people down in the trenches are asked, how long is this going to take? And we need to take that at face value and not say, well, I mean, you can adjust scope. You know, you can say, look, that's just not going to work for a date. What can we get done that we absolutely have to get done by, you know, July 31st or whatever it is. And so you can change scope. And the other thing to keep in mind about date driving things is just adding people is not going to necessarily make you hit the date. I always think of the Mythical Man Month as almost required reading for anybody, because that's where it talks about IBM developing DOS and how they were going at about half speed. So they doubled their people. And because of the management of communication and everything else, the productivity actually decreased. So creativity with Agile and customizable sprints. So there's nothing that says that a sprint has to be 2 weeks. That's not a rule. Be 3 weeks, be 4 weeks, whatever. We find that 3 weeks is usually the best for what we do, but you know, get creative with that, and don't fit into boxes that you don't need to be in. Another big piece is be open to the cloud, quite frankly, and using the cloud to your advantage, because again, it gets back to my point before. The last thing an SMB wants to do is add more labor. They don't want to do that. So if we can offer them options, and it's hard sometimes for IT to grasp that. You know, we had a talk with a client about Cosmos DB And there was a different person outside of our company that was even saying, look, there is no, you don't have DBAs working on this because you pay for that. I mean, that's in the cost. I mean, there is no free lunch. I'm not saying that, but you don't have to have your people working on it. And it was very hard for IT folks to latch onto that. Be open to automation and be open to thinking out of the box as far as automation. So automating, there's a lot of work. I know that we're trying to do some research around how do we automate data governance types of tasks. So there's too much, hand doing catalogs, all that stuff. Get creative with the tools. There's data modeling tools that most organizations aren't even using 30% of the functionality in data modeling tools, with how you can put comments in and how you can track this and how you can track that. And it's a lot more than just putting tables, relationships, and data types on it. In so many places, that's all they use it for. And you can actually expose that information to the business. And then the other big thing I think that is happening and that we're kind of watching and looking at is bringing users to the data. So a person asked about tools, and this isn't specifically a data governance tool, but it does help to put the data in the business's hands. There's a tool called Dremio out there, which basically just exposes data lakes in the cloud, and you can hook up Power BI to it. So all of a sudden, you don't need to move your data lake around, and it has security in it and everything else. Again, it's a newer product that's out there, but so we haven't fully vetted it. But those are just examples of kind of getting creative, and there's a lot more. There's a larger push to start to try to eliminate ETL in some respects because they're brittle. You have to make a lot of change when change happens. And so what can you get in the business hands that will really work? And I just like to thank everybody for listening today. I think the next thing is basically questions and answers. Nick, if there's any other questions on, we only have 3 minutes left. Sorry, I kind of.
No worries. There's a fascinating presentation, and I don't see any other questions from our YouTube audience at the moment.
Okay, great. Well, again, I'd just like to thank everybody for listening today, and I had a wonderful time. And if anybody ever wants to get a hold of me, this information's out there. Nick, I'm more than happy to share this presentation.
Wonderful.
And
Yeah.
So if people want to email me or call me or whatever, that's fine. Text me, however people like to talk amongst this stuff. That'd be wonderful.
And it looks like our declaration of no more questions has spawned a question.
Oh,
Are you
okay.
exploring Microsoft Purview for clients using Azure?
Yes, actually, we are. And Azure is probably in the Midwest here anyway. The Midwest United States tends to be the most popular solution. You go out to the coasts, it tends to be more Amazon. Google, for whatever reason, has been really late to the dance. They at least have general things. Oracle and IBM, just to be really upfront and honest, I see as not really helping themselves because they just keep selling their own stuff. So what Microsoft did that was really smart, in my opinion, is they offered they know that what drives the cloud is nodes. Nodes drives the cloud, and that drives their money making. And so they don't care whether you install Linux, whether you install Windows, whether you install open source. They just want to drive, and that has really benefited them. They also have a lot of codeless type of things like logic apps that businesses can put together, which could help, again, in data governance, as well as a lot of other things. So yeah, Azure is a big one. They're a huge player.
So Frank, you mentioned a new product out there that exposes data end users to the data lake. What was that called again?
That's called Dremio, Dremio. And they actually, interestingly enough, they sponsor this conference called Subsurface. It started today. It's a free thing if you want to check it out. I'm not trying to plug them or anything, believe me.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's an interesting product. We've kind of talked to them. We're doing a little bit of our own. And one of the things that we're trying to do is be more thought leadership and write about things. So yeah, we're kind of
what I've heard about exposing the end users to the data is that the more sophisticated end users are actually more nervous about taking that step. And that's because they understand the complexity of using data. And also all of the work that's done in the background by IT in order to make the data usable in the first place. And they'd rather have it handed up to them than to explore it themselves because of efficiencies from their end. They just want to get on with it. So I think there's a bit of a tension there where users think they want to have access to all this data, but when given it, maybe not.
Yeah, that's a really good observation, Deborah. And I completely agree that I bet that is a problem, especially with that makes sense that it would be a question with the power users. Again, I think that there's some options of how you expose the data. I mean, I think it should be kind of before moving data, I would say, well, let's see what we can do to work within this and to just expose what's needed and not, you don't necessarily have to expose the whole data lake. I think that there's too much of a thought process right now, or at least in the old, I'll call it sort of the older way of thinking. I think people that are kind of disrupting it feel differently, but of immediately just going to an ETL process. And I think it's kind of balancing that out. I mean, I think there always will be ETL. I mean, that's another thing about Azure, right? It's got Data Factory right in it. And again, you pay for it in the sense that when you use it, you pay for it. But it, the entry level of, to an SMB, the entry level of Informatica, for example, being $250,000, I mean, places aren't going to do that.
Right.
You better find other options.
Absolutely. And, what is the other option? To do an in-house with, a developer that, they don't want to add the FTE either. Exactly.
And that's where cloud becomes really attractive. Now, where cloud falls down, of course, is, they try to do too much, right? And you start, putting GPUs out there or something, then you're in big trouble. But anyway, from a money standpoint, you got to be careful of the costs. But if you're sort of, if you put some attention to the costs and understand what you're getting and what you're paying for, it can be very useful.
Right. Well, how far does the argument go of, you should be spending X amount? What is it, 15%, 10% of your gross revenue on IT? How far does that argument go with SMBs as a standard, and if they're not meeting that standard?
I don't think they have any standards, to be honest. And I think you can bring that data in and you can talk about it, but especially within manufacturers. I mean, like when you go into a manufacturer and you start talking about IoT, for example, they're gonna, I mean, they will use a piece of equipment like the laundry place that we were at. I mean, they will use a washing machine until that thing is until it's literally in pieces on the floor. And so they are always looking to, bolt on products if they need for IoT or those sorts of things. So yeah, it's they're looking to stretch their, large scale investments, and sometimes that flies in the face of what, we're trying to do.
Right. Well, perhaps we should wrap up now. We're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Frank. This was a great presentation, as well as a great conversation.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Nick. Thanks,
we should definitely have more of this.
Yeah. Just let me know. I'm more than happy to share about other things. So